Good day everyone, this is Kevin, and in this video I will discuss about the different kinds of obligation. Section 2, obligations with a period. Okay. So our topic is about the meaning of obligation with a period, effect of loss, deterioration or improvement, payment before arrival of period, the debtor presumed aware of period, presumption as the benefit of period, when obligation can be demanded before lapse of period. Okay, so let's start. An obligation with a period is a kind of obligation wherein its performance is subject to a term or period and can only be demandable when that period expires. Such period is a day certain, which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. Okay, so according to Article 1193, obligations for whose fulfillment a day certain has been fixed shall be demandable only when that day comes. Obligations with a resolutory period take effect at once, but terminate upon arrival of the day certain. A day certain is understood to be that which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. If the uncertainty consists in whether the day will come or not, the obligation is conditional, and it shall be regulated by the rules of the preceding section 1125A. Okay, so let us define the meaning of obligation with a period. So it is a period in one whose effect. Okay, so now let's define the obligation with a period. So an obligation with a period is one whose effects or consequences are subjected in one way or another to the expiration or arrival of said period or term. So, period or term is a future and certain event upon the arrival of which the obligation or right subject to it either arises or is terminated. So, it is a day certain which must necessarily come, like for example, the year 2010, next Christmas, although it may not be known when, like the death of a person. Okay, so you can see that in Article 1193, Part 3. So next is let us differentiate the period and condition. So as the fulfillment, a period is a certain event which must happen sooner or later at a date known beforehand or at a time which cannot be determined, while a condition is an uncertain event. Okay? So as to time, a period refers only to the future, while a condition may refer also to a past event unknown to the parties. As to influence on the obligation, a period merely fixes the time for the efficaciousness of the obligation. It's suspensive, it cannot prevent the birth of the obligation in due time. If resolutory, it does not invalidate the fact that obligation existed. On the other hand, a condition causes an obligation either to arise or to cease. Okay? So as to effect, when left to debtor's will, a period which depends upon the will of the debtor empowers the court to fix the duration thereof. You can see this in Article 1197, Part 2, while a condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor invalidates the obligation. Article 1182, and lastly is the stu and lastly as the retroactivity of effects. So unless there is an agreement to the contrary, the arrival of a period does not have any retroactive effect, while the happening of a condition has retroactive effect. Okay? So now let us talk about the kinds of period or term. So according to effect, a suspensive period or X day, the obligation begins only from a day or from a day certain upon the arrival of period. And resolutory period in DM, the obligation is valid up to a day certain and terminates upon arrival of the period. Okay. So like a period must be possible. If the period is impossible, for example, is February 30 because it will never come. And for example, is the construction of a building within 24 hours, it is impossible because it is too short. Okay. So therefore, the obligation is void. So here in the example of suspensive period or X day, one of the example of this is I will pay you for 30 days from today. Okay? So here the obligation will start from today. Obligation begins only from a day certain upon the arrival of a period. So meaning that the obligation that I will pay you for 30 days from today will start from today. While the resolutory period or idiom, for example, I will give you 500 a month until the end of the year. So here the obligation is valid up to a day certain and terminates upon arrival of the period. So in this example, I will giving you 500 a month. It is ongoing and I will stop to give you 500 a month after the end of the year. Okay? So next is according to source, the legal period when it is provided for by laws, conventional or voluntary period when it is agreed to by the parties, and judicial period when it is fixed by the court. So according to definiteness, definite period when it is fixed or it is known when it will come, and indefinite period when it is not fixed or it is not known when it will come, where the period is not fixed but a period is intended. The courts are usually empowered by law to fix the same. Okay? So now let's talk about the payment before arrival of period. So Article 1195 applies only to obligation to give. It is similar to Article 1188, paragraph 2, which allows the recovery of what has been paid by mistake before the fulfillment of a suspensive condition. Okay? So okay. So here, the creditor cannot unjustly enrich himself by retaining the thing or money received before the arrival of the period. Okay? So next is the debtor presumed aware of period. So the presumption, however, that the debtor knew that the debt was not yet due. So he has the burden of proving that he was unaware of the period, where the duration of the period depends upon the will of the debtor. Payment by him amounts, in fact, to his determination of the arrival of the period. So the obliger may no longer recover the thing or money once the period has arrived, but he can recover the fruits or interest thereof from the date of premature performance to the date of maturity of the obligation. So for example, no recovery in personal obligations. So according to Article 1195, has no application to obligations to do or not to do, because as to the former, it is physically impossible to recover the service rendered, and as to the latter, as the obliger performs by not doing, he cannot, of course, recover what he has not done. Okay? So according to Article 1196, whenever in an obligation a period is designated, it is presumed to have been established for um, the benefit of both the creditor and the debtor, unless from the tenor of the same or other circumstances, it should appear that the period has been established in favor of one of the other. Let's move on to the presumption as to benefit of period. So in an obligation subject to a period fixed by the parties, the period is presumed to have been established for the benefit of both the creditor and the debtor. Okay, so this means that before the expiration of the period, the debtor may not fulfill the obligation and neither may the creditor demand its fulfillment without the consent of the other, especially if the latter would be prejudiced or inconvenienced thereby. So the presumption, of course, is rebuttable. Okay, for example, um, on January 1, Anna borrowed from Elsa 10,000 payable on December 31 at 15% interest. So George cannot pay before December 31 without the consent of Elsa. So neither can compel George to pay before the expiration of the term. So it is presumed that the period designated, which is December 31, has been established for the benefit of both. And Anna is benefited because he can use the money for 1 year. So Elsa is also benefited because of the interest the money would earn for 1 year. So in a contract of loan with interest, the term is generally for the benefit of both the lender and the borrower. Okay? So this is also the case even where there is no interest stipulated, but where under the contract the creditor receives in place of interest other benefits by reason of the period. And obviously in the above example, okay? So for example, on January 1, George borrowed from
Anna,
10,000 payable on December 31 at 15% interest. So George cannot pay before December 31 without the consent of Anna. Neither can compel George to pay before the expiration of the term. So it is presumed that the period designated, which is December 31, has been established for the benefit of both. George is benefited because he can use the money for 1 year, and Anna is also benefited because of the interest the money would earn for 1 year. So in a contract of loan with interest, the term is generally for the benefit of both the lender and the borrower. So this is also the case even when there is no interest stipulated but we're under the contract, the creditor receives in place of interest other benefits by reason of the period. So obviously, in the above example, George can pay Anna before December 31 provided the payment includes the interest for 1 year, where the obligation of George is to deliver, say, 100 bags of rice. Anna cannot be compelled to accept performance before the expiration of the period, especially if he would be prejudiced or inconvenienced thereby. Okay, so next is the exception to the general rule. So the tenor of the obligation or the circumstances may, however, show that it was the intention of the parties to constitute the period for the benefit of either the debtor or the creditor. So the benefit of the period may be the subject of express stipulation of the parties. So number one is the term is for the benefit of the debtor alone. So he cannot be compelled to pay prematurely, but he can if he desires to do so. So, for example of this is George borrowed from Anna 1,000 to be paid within 1 year without interest. So, in this case, the period of 1 year should be deemed intended for the benefits of George only. So, therefore, he can pay anytime, but he cannot comply to pay before 1 year. Okay. So, next is the term is for the benefit of the creditor. So he may demand fulfillment even before the arrival of the term, but the debtor cannot require him to accept payment before the expiration of the stipulated period. So for example, in this term, it's for the benefit of the creditor. Okay? So for example, is George borrowed from Anna 1,000 payable on December 31 with the stipulation that George cannot make payment before the lapse of the period, but Anna may demand fulfillment even before said date. So here, Anna can demand payment at any time, but George cannot shorten the 1 year period without the consent of Anna. Ordinarily, there must be a stipulation granting the benefit of the term to only the now the computation of term or period. So the Administrative Code of 1987, however, provides legal periods. A year shall be understood be to divide 12 calendar months, month of 30 days, unless it refers to a specific calendar month, in which case it shall be computed according to the number of days the specific months contains. So day to a day of 24 hours and night from sunset to sunrise. Okay? So a calendar month is a month designated in the calendar without regard to the number of days it may contain. So it is the period of time running from the beginning of a certain number date up to but not if there is not sufficient number of days in the next month. So then up to and including the last day of that month. So according to Article 1197, if the obligation does not fix a period, but from its nature and the circumstances, it can be inferred that a period was intended. The courts may fix the duration thereof. So another one, the court shall also fix the duration of the period when it depends upon the will of the debtor. So in every case, the court shall determine such period as may under the circumstances have been probably contemplated by the parties. So once fixed by the courts, the period cannot be changed by them. Okay? Okay, so next is the court generally without power to fix a period. So the period mentioned in the above provision refers to a judicial period as distinguished from the period fixed by the parties in their contract, which is known as contractual period. So if the obligation does not state a period and no period is intended, the court is not authorized to fix a period. The courts have no right to make contracts for the parties. Okay, so if the obligation does not state a period and no period is intended, the court is not authorized to fix a period. The courts have no right to make contracts for the parties. Okay, so the exception to the general rule. Okay, so for example of this is like, for example, George obliged himself to pay Anna 10,000. So since the obligation does not fix a period, not even the court may fix a period. So the reason is because the contract is the law between the parties and its terms cannot be changed by the court. Okay. So next is, there is an exception to the general rule. Okay, so under Article 1197, there are two cases when the court is authorized to fix the duration of the period. Article 1197 is part and parcel of all obligations contemplated therein. Hence, whenever the court fixes the term of an obligation, it does not thereby amend or modify the same. It merely enforces or carries out of the intention of the parties. It cannot arbitrarily it cannot it, it cannot arbitrarily fix a period out of thin air. Okay? So one of the exceptions to the general rule is when no period is fixed but a period was intended. So the obligation does not fix a period, but it can be inferred from its nature and the circumstances that a period was intended. Okay, for example, George agreed to construct the house of Anna. So the parties failed to fix the period within which the construction is to be made. So here, the court can fix the term, for it's evident that the parties intended that George should construct the house within a certain period. Okay? So next one is the duration of the period depends upon the will of the debtor. So in these two cases, the court must fix the duration of the period to forestall the possibility that the obligation may never be fulfilled. So in fixing the term, the court is merely enforcing the implied stipulation of the parties. So in every case, the court shall determine such period as may under the circumstances have been probably contemplated by the parties. Okay? So let's move on to the legal effect where suspensive period or condition depends upon will of the debtor. So there are two. First one is the existence of the obligation is not affected, although the period depends upon the sole will of the debtor. So it is only the performance with respect to time that is left to the will of the debtor. Second, if the obligation is subject to a condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation is void because in such case, it is actually the fulfillment of the obligation that depends upon the will of the debtor. Okay? So period fixed cannot be changed by the courts. So if there is a period agreed upon and it has already lapsed, the court cannot fix another period. So from the very moment the parties give their acceptance and consent to the period fixed by the court, said period acquires the nature of a contract because the effect of such acceptance and consent by the parties is exactly the same as if they had expressly agreed upon it. So, and having been agreed upon by them, it becomes a law governing their contract. However, the parties may modify the term by a new agreement. Okay? So Article 1198, the debtor shall lose every right to make use of the period when, after the obligation has been contracted, he becomes insolvent unless he gives a guarantee or security for the debt. When he does Second, when he does not furnish to the creditor of the guarantees or securities which he has promised. Third, when by his own acts he has impaired said guarantees or securities after their establishment, and when through a fortuitous event they disappear, unless he immediately gives the new ones equally satisfactory. Fourth, when the debtor violates any undertaking, Fourth, when the debtor violates any undertaking in consideration of which the creditor agreed to the period. Fifth, when the debtor attempts to abscond. Okay? And lastly, when obligation can be demanded before lapse period. So we must know it that when the debtor becomes insolvent, the obligation can be demanded before lapse period. Second, when the debtor does no furnish guarantees or securities promised. Third, when guarantees or securities given have been impaired or have disappeared. Fourth, when the debtor violates an undertaking. And fifth, when the debtor's attempts to abscond. Okay? That is my report and thank you for listening.